The year was 1266, and the great Kublai Khan, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known, cast his gaze eastward across the Sea of Japan. From his court in Daegu, present-day Beijing, he oversaw lands stretching from frozen Siberia to the lush jungles of Vietnam, from the deserts of Persia to the shores of Korea. But there, perched just beyond his grasp, was an island kingdom called Nippon, Japan. Small, mountainous, and shrouded in mist, it was known more for its poetry and painted screens than for military might. To Kublai, it looked like low-hanging fruit. The Mongols had not yet failed to conquer a place they set their eyes on. Their armies moved like hurricanes, fast, brutal, and unstoppable. China's mighty Song dynasty was collapsing beneath Kublai's boots. Korea had been subdued and absorbed. Japan? It was simply next. He sent formal letters to the Japanese imperial court, written in elegant Chinese, demanding tribute as a show of submission. The response? Silence. Not even a polite rejection, just nothing. Kublai was insulted, and that was not a safe thing to do to a Mongol Khan. But Kublai didn't understand Japan. Not really. He knew it was a series of islands, populated by rice farmers and lords who styled themselves samurai, but he underestimated the depth of their independence, or their capacity for resistance. Japan was not a unified empire like China. It was a patchwork of clans, each loyal to their own lord, but tied together loosely under the rule of an emperor, and more powerfully, the military dictatorship of the shogunate. The current shogun was a boy, so real power lay in the hands of a warrior family called the Hojo, who ruled from Kamakura. Still, the Mongols were terrifying. Stories began to filter into Japan about their conquests, how they leveled cities with catapults, how their horsemen could shoot arrows while riding backward, how they showed no mercy to those who resisted. Japanese monks warned of foreign ghosts with flaming weapons. Panic started to spread, especially in the southern island of Kyushu, the likely landing spot for any invasion force. But for now, it was only threats. Kublai sent another letter, this one more forceful. Still no answer. And so, with a mix of pride and frustration, Kublai did what any Mongol emperor would do when words failed. He prepared for war. In Korea, the Mongol Empire had a foothold in the Goryeo kingdom, and they forced the Koreans to build ships, supply troops, and help plan the campaign. The plan was to assemble a powerful fleet, sail across the sea, and strike Japan hard and fast. Kublai believed Japan could be bent to his will in a matter of weeks. But he was walking into a storm, both literally and metaphorically. What Kublai couldn't see from his palace was the depth of Japanese culture's martial roots. For centuries, the samurai class had lived by a code of honor called Bushido. War wasn't just politics by other means, it was a sacred duty. Samurai trained from childhood to wield the sword, to ride, to fight, and if necessary, to die with dignity. Their armor may have looked strange to Mongol eyes, colorful, with flowing silk cords, but behind that beauty was a deep devotion to their land and lords. And the terrain itself was deceptive. Japan was a land of steep coasts, sharp mountain passes, and fast-changing weather. What looked like a string of small, defenseless islands was in fact a natural fortress. Still, in 1274, the Mongols moved. They built hundreds of ships, some large, some little more than floating rafts. Korean shipbuilders, often working under duress, labored day and night. Soldiers from across the empire, Mongols, Koreans, Chinese, were gathered. They had rockets, poison-tipped arrows, and drums that thundered across the waves. This was not a raid. This was a message: submit, or be destroyed. In Japan, temple bells tolled warnings, and samurai began to gather near Hakata Bay on Kyushu's northern shore. They built wooden palisades, trained in small groups, and waited. There was no standing national army. Each clan sent what they could, hoping it would be enough. For now, there were more prayers than strategies. And so, as winter approached in 1274, Kublai Khan launched the first Mongol invasion of Japan. Thousands of men boarded ships, armored horses snorted on crowded decks, and banners snapped in the salty air. The sea shimmered ahead. Japan loomed on the horizon. What lay ahead would be chaos, confusion, and a lesson in the limits of ambition. The Mongols thought they were bringing war to a fractured island. But they were about to encounter something far fiercer than they expected, not just warriors, but a land and people forged by storm and steel. The Mongol fleet landed at Tsushima Island first, a small outpost between Korea and Japan. The defenders, few in number, fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed. Villages were torched, civilians slaughtered, and the temples fell silent under the roar of foreign drums. It was the first time in memory that an invading force had set foot on Japanese soil, and the shockwaves rippled far inland. Next came Iki Island, where the Mongols unleashed terrifying new tactics. Unlike the Japanese, who were used to individual combat and ritual duels, the Mongols fought as a coordinated war machine. They used loud percussion instruments to time their attacks, launched explosive projectiles from catapults, and formed tight shield walls. The Japanese defenders, bold but disorganized, were slaughtered. Those who surrendered were often executed. To the Mongols, mercy was weakness. To the Japanese, this brutality was alien and deeply disturbing. But as the Mongols moved toward the main islands, the fight began to shift. When the invaders reached Hakata Bay on Kyushu, they encountered more prepared resistance. Local samurai clans had fortified the beaches with wooden barricades, high enough to stall horses and thick enough to block arrows. The Japanese defenders took position behind these walls, their bows strung and swords sharpened. The first clashes were brutal. The Mongols disembarked in waves, clambering over each other in the surf, banging drums to disorient the enemy. They fired rocket-like missiles and used poisoned arrows. Japanese samurai, trained for one-on-one combat, had to adjust fast. They found themselves facing enemies who didn't wait for a formal challenge or a bow, just an onslaught of coordinated violence. Mongol archers would kneel behind shield bearers, fire, and retreat. Spearmen filled the gaps. It was a deadly dance. The Japanese pushed back fiercely. At night, small groups of samurai swam to Mongol ships, climbed aboard silently, and attacked sleeping soldiers in close quarters. These surprise raids rattled the invaders, who were used to swift battles, not drawn-out skirmishes with ghost-like enemies. The Mongols grew cautious. They began to retreat from the shore, pulling their ships back into open water to regroup. And then came the wind. Without warning, a typhoon roared in from the south. The sea, once calm, rose with fury. Torrential rain poured down. Waves crashed with deafening force. Mongol ships, many hastily built, some flat-bottomed and not designed for open sea, were slammed against each other and the rocky coastline. Sailors screamed, oars shattered, and men drowned by the hundreds. The storm showed no mercy. Japanese chroniclers watched in awe. From the cliffs above Hakata Bay, monks recorded what they saw as divine intervention. They would later call it Kamikaze, the divine wind. In their eyes, the gods had sent the storm to protect the homeland from foreign devils. By morning, the invasion was broken. Thousands of bodies floated in the surf. Ships lay splintered like driftwood. Survivors staggered ashore only to be cut down or captured by the Japanese. Others fled into the sea, never to return. The cost was enormous. Estimates vary, but it's believed that of the roughly 20,000 to 30,000 troops who embarked on that invasion, as many as half perished in the storm or at the sword. The Koreans, forced to participate under Mongol rule, bore heavy losses. Their coastline would later be littered with wreckage and bodies washing ashore. Kublai Khan, back in his court, was furious, but not defeated. To him, this was a setback, not a failure. He blamed the weather, not the Japanese, and vowed to return. He ordered more ships, demanded more resources from Korea and China, and began planning a second, even larger invasion. If the gods had intervened once, he would challenge them again. His pride and his reputation demanded it. Meanwhile, in Japan, the victory brought no rest. The Japanese knew this wasn't over. The Mongols were not the kind of enemy to accept humiliation quietly. The shogunate in Kamakura began urgent work. Coastal defenses were reinforced, watchtowers built, and messenger systems improved. The shogunate ordered the construction of an enormous seawall, about 2 meters high and stretching for miles, across the shores of Hakata Bay. It wasn't just to stop ships, it was to give the samurai high ground and force attackers into narrow, predictable paths. Samurai began training harder, changing their tactics to face mass formations instead of single combat. Local lords were ordered to maintain ready reserves, rotate watch patrols, and ensure supplies could be gathered at a moment's notice. No one knew when the Mongols would return, but everyone knew they would. And yet, amidst the fear and preparation, there was something else: pride. A sense that Japan had stared down the world's most terrifying military force, and survived. The kami, the ancestral spirits of the land, had protected them. The emperor performed rituals of gratitude. Buddhist monks lit lanterns along the coast in memory of the fallen, and in hopes the spirits would be just as watchful next time. But across the sea, the storm had planted a seed of obsession in Kublai Khan. He believed his first campaign had almost succeeded. All he needed was more men, more ships, and better luck with the weather. So he began to build. The winds may have driven back the first invasion, but Japan knew better than to believe in miracles twice. After 1274, a palpable sense of urgency pulsed through the veins of the nation. While temples gave thanks to the gods for the divine wind, the warrior leaders of Japan did not sit back and wait for another blessing. The next Mongol invasion wouldn't catch them by surprise, and this time, they would be ready. At the center of this surge of preparedness stood the Hojo regents in Kamakura, wielding power through the shogunate. Though the emperor still sat on the throne in Kyoto, the real political and military decisions came from Kamakura's military council. The Hojo clan may have lacked the flash of battlefield legends, but their cold, calculating leadership held Japan together when unity mattered most. They knew the Mongols would return in greater numbers. Spies and Korean refugees whispered rumors of shipbuilding on a scale never seen before. Ports in Goryeo were bursting with lumber, blacksmiths were forging endless weapons, and Chinese engineers were being pressed into service. Japan braced for an enemy more prepared, more determined, and even more furious. So the Japanese adapted, and fast. The defensive wall at Hakata Bay, started after the first invasion, was extended. This Genko Borui, or Mongol defense wall, stretched for kilometers. Made of stone and earth, it stood strong enough to stop charging cavalry and tall enough to make climbing a slow, exposed affair. Behind the wall, firing platforms allowed archers and matchlock gunners to rain down projectiles on invaders before they even reached land. But physical barriers alone wouldn't be enough. The samurai class, fierce as they were, had to change the way they fought. In 1274, the Mongols had ignored the ritual challenges of single combat and had advanced in terrifying formations, using coordinated strikes and thunderous drums. It wasn't just a culture clash, it was a strategic mismatch. So the samurai adapted. They drilled for formation fighting, learned to fight in tighter units, and coordinated with archers rather than operating as lone heroes. They began training messengers and organizing response units across multiple provinces. This wasn't just a defense of Kyushu anymore, every coastal province was on alert. Fishermen reported ship sightings, monks served as scribes and lookouts, and women learned to carry weapons in case villages were overrun. The spirit of resistance saturated every corner of Japanese life. The fear of the Mongols even seeped into religious practice. Monasteries organized mass prayers and offered talismans for protection. The famous Zen master Magaku Sojin reportedly encouraged warriors to face death with clarity, reminding them that honor, not survival, was the ultimate reward. Samurai philosophy deepened, hardened by the looming threat of annihilation. Meanwhile, clan rivalries, normally a source of endless feuds and petty wars, were set aside. The prospect of foreign occupation, of losing not just land but culture, drove a wedge between old habits and new necessity. The shogunate sent envoys across provinces demanding military service, food stores, and loyalty. Some clans resisted, hesitant to place trust in central authority, but most complied. The enemy wasn't a neighboring lord, it was a storm of men coming from across the sea. And in Kamakura, the bureaucracy swelled. Officials tallied supplies, coordinated port defenses, and even debated tax reform to support the war effort. Some questioned the cost. After all, the first invasion had been a disaster for the Mongols. What if it had been a fluke? But others saw what was coming. The preparations were not just for a second battle, but for a defining test of Japan's identity. To fall now would be to fall forever. While Japan steeled itself, the Mongol Empire was straining under its own ambition. Kublai Khan, despite his immense resources, was beginning to feel the costs. Shipbuilding on this scale demanded more than wood and nails, it demanded men, time, and political leverage. The Chinese Song dynasty, though conquered in the south, still resisted in pockets, and Kublai had to siphon soldiers from other campaigns. Korea, under Mongol control, was exhausted. Forced conscription drained its villages. Famines broke out as resources were diverted to the military. Still, the Khan pressed on. He ordered the construction of two massive invasion forces. One would depart from Korea, the other from southern China. Together, they would converge on Japan with more than 140,000 men and nearly 4,000 ships, a force that, if successful, would be unmatched in scale for centuries. For context, the famous D-Day invasion of 1944 involved a similar number of troops. This was not just war. This was spectacle. But spectacle doesn't guarantee victory. Coordination between the Korean and Chinese fleets would prove challenging. Different launch dates, conflicting commands, and unfamiliar seas introduced chaos long before the sails even caught wind. Chinese shipbuilders, many coerced into service, built vessels ill-suited to the open Pacific. Many were riverboats, not ocean-worthy craft. Still, Kublai insisted on a show of strength, convinced that sheer numbers would overpower any resistance. As spring turned to summer in 1281, the fleets began to move. In Japan, watchmen spotted sails on the horizon. Bells rang. Beacons were lit across mountain tops. The invasion had begun. But something was different this time. Japan was no longer a scattered patchwork of nervous defenders. It was a nation waiting, fortified, and alert. Samurai stood behind stone walls, arrows notched, eyes sharp. Children were moved inland. Temples hummed with quiet prayers. The fear was still there, yes, but so was resolve. Whatever storm the Mongols brought this time, Japan intended to meet it head-on. The next clash would not be short. It would be a slow grind of attrition, a test of endurance, and an unforgettable dance between ambition and resistance, man and nature, steel and wind. In the summer of 1281, the Mongols came back, this time with the largest amphibious invasion force the world had ever seen. Over 4,000 ships crowded the Yellow Sea, a patchwork of vessels from Korea and southern China, bristling with warriors, horses, and weapons. Kublai Khan had outdone himself. This wasn't a punitive expedition like before, it was a full-scale conquest. Japan was not to be frightened into surrender. It was to be flattened. But the scale of the invasion turned out to be part of the problem. The two-pronged assault was designed to converge on Kyushu, with one armada leaving from Korea, known as the Eastern Route Army, and another, much larger, from China, the Southern Route Army. But bad weather, logistical confusion, and sheer mismanagement threw the plan into chaos from the start. The Eastern Army arrived earlier than expected and had no choice but to wait near Hakata Bay for their southern counterparts. As days turned into weeks, the troops grew restless, supplies dwindled, and the Japanese struck hard. Unlike in 1274, the Japanese didn't wait passively behind walls. They launched daring night raids from small boats, slipping between Mongol vessels, boarding them, and unleashing quick, bloody skirmishes. These weren't large battles, but they were constant. They wore the Mongols down. The invaders couldn't sleep, couldn't relax, couldn't predict the next attack. Some ships were set ablaze, others sabotaged. For men used to thundering across land on horseback, the slow suffering at sea was unbearable. The Southern Army, meanwhile, struggled just to reach Japan. Their ships, many not designed for long voyages, were battered by storms and poor navigation. When they finally arrived, they found the Eastern Army already fraying at the edges, demoralized and depleted. Coordination between the two forces was poor. Different languages, commanders, and strategies created confusion, not cohesion. Still, the Mongols tried to press their attack. They landed troops on the islands of Iki and Tsushima once again, this time with brutal efficiency. Villages were razed. Defenders slaughtered. But when they reached the mainland of Kyushu, they ran into the full force of Japanese resistance. Hakata Bay had been transformed. The wall stretched along the coast, with samurai stationed at regular intervals. Behind it were reserves of fresh warriors, ready to rotate and end fight. Japanese archers stood in towers, firing at any ship that came too close. The Mongols struggled to land troops in significant numbers. And when they did, they were quickly met by organized counterattacks. Samurai tactics had evolved. No more one-on-one duels with shouted names and formal bows. Now, they fought in teams, using coordinated strikes and defensive lines. And the raids continued, small boats darting in and out, targeting isolated ships and stealing supplies. The Mongols began losing ships not in grand naval battles, but through 1,000 cuts. And then, as if summoned by collective memory and the prayers of a nation, the wind began to rise again. In August, a typhoon slammed into the southern coast of Japan. It was worse than the one in 1274. Entire squadrons of ships were hurled into each other. Anchors snapped. Vessels capsized. Soldiers drowned by the thousands, sucked beneath crashing waves or dashed against rocks. The harbor became a graveyard. Bodies floated to shore for days. Armor, weapons, and shattered hulls washed up along the coast, testifying to the scale of the disaster. Many of the Mongol ships had been hastily constructed, flat-bottomed, and overcrowded. They didn't stand a chance in the open sea. The ocean, like the Japanese warriors before it, showed no mercy. Estimates vary, but it's believed over 100,000 men were lost, many to the storm, others to disease and combat. The few who survived were captured or killed upon landing. The Mongol army was annihilated. This time, there was no retreat. There was no rebuilding. The Khan's colossal gamble had failed, spectacularly. Back in Dadu, Kublai Khan received the news with disbelief. His fury was legendary, but his power had limits. The empire was overstretched. Rebellion stirred in Vietnam. His wars in China dragged on. The treasury groaned under the weight of constant campaigns. The emperor of the world had met a wall he could not breach, not one of stone, but of spirit and sea. Japan, once seen as a prize ripe for plucking, had become the place where Mongol ambition shattered. The Japanese, too, were stunned. Their prayers had been answered again, but the toll had been enormous. Thousands of their own had died defending the homeland. Entire regions were left scorched. Families had lost sons, husbands, fathers. But there was a quiet pride in their suffering. They had done what no other nation had, stood toe-to-toe with the Mongol horde and pushed it back, twice. The storm was again named Kamikaze, divine wind. But this time, the phrase took on deeper meaning. It wasn't just nature that had saved Japan. It was preparation, unity, and sheer determination. The wind was divine, yes, but the warriors were human, and they had bled for every inch of ground they held. As the fires burned out and the storm clouds cleared, Japan stood tall, not untouched, but unbowed. The typhoon may have delivered the final blow, but to blame nature alone for the Mongol defeat would be to overlook the deeper forces at work. Japan's victory was not the product of luck, it was the culmination of geography, culture, and preparation woven tightly together like the silken cords of a samurai's armor. To understand why Kublai Khan failed, one must look beyond the storm. Geography came first. Japan is a land sculpted by volcanoes and fringed with cliffs. Its coasts are rarely gentle, they are steep, rugged, and unpredictable. Landing troops on such shores was never going to be easy. Unlike the flat beaches of China or Korea, where armies could disembark by the thousands in orderly fashion, Japanese terrain forced ships to approach in fragmented clusters. Rocky headlands broke up formations. Harbors were shallow, forcing many Mongol vessels to anchor far from shore. That created a logistical nightmare. How do you move horses, siege weapons, and men across choppy waters under fire? But geography only tells part of the story. The Japanese people themselves were shaped by centuries of internal conflict and natural hardship. Earthquakes, typhoons, and civil war were not new to them, they were part of daily life. This constant exposure to chaos bred a culture of resilience. The samurai class, in particular, was forged in this crucible. Raised on tales of loyalty, sacrifice, and courage, they had been preparing for a moment like this all their lives. The Mongols expected Japan to fracture under pressure. They assumed the scattered clans would be too disorganized to mount real resistance. But in fact, the Mongol threat acted like a forge, melting rivalries and recasting them into unity. The Kamakura shogunate may have ruled through force and tradition, but in this moment, they became the heart of national defense. That unity extended beyond the battlefield. Peasants helped dig trenches and build walls. Monks offered blessings, but also passed messages and tracked enemy movements. Women ran farms and supplied food to warriors. The entire country moved like a single, stubborn organism, determined to survive. Even the Japanese system of warfare, once mocked by Mongol observers as archaic, had evolved. After the shock of 1274, the samurai had studied their enemies. They adopted new tactics, borrowed formations, and built a flexible command structure. They moved quickly between defense and offense, mastered coastal raids, and used every inch of their homeland to their advantage. Compare this with the Mongols' approach. Their empire was a marvel of logistics and fearsome tactics, but it was built for land. Their cavalry ruled the steppes. Their siege engines crushed city walls. But the sea was a different beast. Naval warfare was never their strength. Forcing Chinese and Korean shipbuilders to create a navy overnight led to inconsistencies, poorly constructed vessels, and little cohesion between fleets. And on the sea, coordination is everything. The Mongols also underestimated time. The longer they waited offshore for the two fleets to unite, the more vulnerable they became. Disease spread in cramped ships. Supplies ran low. Morale cracked. The Japanese, on land and well-fed, only grew stronger. Some historians point to arrogance. Kublai Khan believed his sheer force of will, and numbers, could overcome anything. He had conquered the Song dynasty. He had bent Korea to his knee. Surely Japan, a sliver of mountainous land, could be brought to heel. But war is not a chessboard, and arrogance is a dangerous general. The Kamikaze was not just a wind, it was a symbol. It reminded the Japanese that their fate was tied to their land, their ancestors, and their unity. The storms might have shattered Mongol ships, but it was Japanese determination that had kept those ships at sea in the first place. And then there's the question of what Japan risked. For the Mongols, Japan was a jewel to be added to a crown already heavy with victories. But for the Japanese it was home. They fought not to expand, but to preserve. Not for glory, but for continuity. That kind of motivation is difficult to measure, but impossible to defeat. In the aftermath of the second failed invasion, Japan did not grow complacent. The shogunate kept defenses up for years, afraid of a third attack. They maintained garrisons, trained new warriors, and monitored the seas. But gradually it became clear the Mongols would not return. Back in the vast Mongol Empire, Kublai Khan faced increasing internal strife. His advisors warned against more invasions. Treasury officials pointed to depleted funds. And in the south, revolts and new wars consumed his attention. Japan, that stubborn island, had slipped from his grasp, and would remain beyond it forever. The tale of the Mongol invasions became more than history. It became legend. The twin storms, the courage of the samurai, the divine wind, all of it was woven into the Japanese identity like threads in a warrior's banner. Children grew up hearing stories of how the gods had saved the nation. Priests performed rituals in gratitude. Artists painted scenes of wrecked ships and brave warriors. But beneath the myth was a truth far more powerful: Japan had saved itself. And perhaps that's the final answer to why the invasion failed. It wasn't just the weather. It wasn't just bad planning. It was that the Mongols had underestimated something they couldn't see on a map or weigh in a report. They had underestimated the soul of a people defending the only home they had ever known. In the years that followed the failed invasions, both Japan and the Mongol Empire were left permanently altered, not just in military terms, but in memory, identity, and purpose. The failed conquest was not a pause in Mongol momentum, it was a turning point. And in Japan, it was more than a victory. It was a rebirth. For the Mongols, the defeat was a rare humiliation. Kublai Khan had poured immense resources into the invasions, conscripted labor, gold, ships, and manpower from across his sprawling empire. And what did he gain? Nothing but loss. Over 100,000 dead, a fractured navy, and a blow to his invincible reputation. This was the beginning of decline. Though the Yuan dynasty continued to rule China for decades, cracks began to spread. Rebellions ignited in the south. The cost of constant campaigns drained the treasury. The awe that once followed the Mongol name began to fade into weariness. Even within Kublai's court, questions arose. Had ambition outstripped wisdom? Was it time to stop expanding and start sustaining? The Mongol Empire did not fall because of Japan alone, but Japan exposed its limits. It reminded the world that even the greatest force could be resisted. That a small, determined island could stop a tidal wave. And in Japan, the effects ran even deeper. The narrative of divine protection, the Kamikaze, became more than folklore. It was institutionalized. It was taught in temples, recorded by monks, etched into scrolls. The idea that the gods themselves had intervened created a sacred sense of destiny. Japan was not just lucky. It was chosen. The spirits of the land, the ancestors, the emperors, all had acted in concert to shield the nation. This belief would echo through centuries. It would influence politics, religion, and even future military ideologies. The idea that Japan was under divine protection, and thus inherently unique, became a central pillar of national identity. It instilled both pride and caution. For centuries, Japan turned inward, wary of foreign contact, reluctant to engage beyond its shores. The memory of the Mongol threat lingered. The Kamakura shogunate, for its part, was praised for organizing the defense. But the cost of war was high, and it didn't end with the last Mongol shipwreck. Maintaining readiness, paying warriors, and funding infrastructure drained the regime. Many samurai were never properly compensated for their service, which bred resentment. Over time, internal instability grew. The very unity that had saved Japan began to unravel. Still, for a time, there was peace. The beaches of Kyushu, once littered with bodies and broken ships, returned to quiet. The seawalls slowly eroded. Children played where warriors once bled. And the memory of the invasions passed into legend. Yet legend has a long reach. Centuries later, during World War II, the word kamikaze would be revived, this time not as a wind, but as a weapon. Japanese pilots, in desperate defense of their homeland, hurled themselves into enemy ships in suicide missions. It was a tragic, brutal echo of a sacred story. The divine wind had become human fury. But the original kamikaze was not about destruction. It was about defense. It was about a nation that stood against impossible odds and endured, not through superior power, but through cohesion, spirit, and a profound connection to its land. And it wasn't just the winds that changed history. It was the wall builders, the coastal scouts, the peasant farmers who carried food to the front, the monks who rang temple bells in the dark, warning of sails on the horizon, the women who kept families alive while the men defended the shore, and the samurai, who adapted their traditions not just to survive, but to protect something larger than honor, their home. The wreckage of Mongol ships still lies beneath the waters near Kyushu. In the 20th century, divers found anchors, helmets, and weaponry buried in the silt. These sunken artifacts are not just archaeological finds. They are fragments of a turning point, the moment when the unstoppable was stopped, not by an empire, but by an island. And in those quiet waters, the wind still blows,